on bag as he strode through the bustling terminal. He didn't mind the chaos of airports. In fact, he thrived in it. The crowds, the announcements, the hurried energy, it all reminded him of how far he'd come. From a struggling intern in a tech startup to the CEO of his own multinational company, Daniel had earned his place in the first-class lounge. But today, something was off. He couldn't shake the nagging unease that had settled in his chest ever since his morning meeting ran late. His assistant had frantically rescheduled his flight, leaving him with barely enough time to sprint to the gate. He hated being rushed. Still, he moved briskly, weaving through clusters of travelers. His eyes flicked from the departure boards to the crowd. Then, just as he rounded the corner toward his gate, he froze mid-step. There she was, Emily. Her unmistakable profile, sharp yet softened by age, stood out among the throng of passengers. She was standing by a row of chairs, casually flipping through her phone, her lips curling slightly, as if reacting to some distant thought. Daniel felt the air leave his lungs. It had been nearly 18 years. 18 years since he'd walked out of that tiny apartment they once shared, chasing a dream she hadn't understood. 18 years since their last heated argument about priorities, ambition, and the kind of life he wanted versus the life she believed in. But it wasn't just Emily that rooted him to the spot. It was who stood beside her. 3 teenage boys, no more than 15 or 16 if he had to guess, flanked her, each absorbed in their own world. One was scrolling through a phone, his face an expressionless mask. Another had headphones clamped over his ears, bobbing his head to music only he could hear. The third had his hands stuffed into his hoodie pockets, shifting his weight restlessly as though he wanted to be anywhere else. And they all looked like him. Daniel's mind raced. It wasn't a vague resemblance. It wasn't the sort of passing familiarity you might feel when spotting someone with the same hair color or bone structure. These boys could have been pulled from old photographs of him at that age. The same sandy blonde hair, the angular jawline, the faintly mischievous spark in their eyes. He blinked, half expecting the scene to change, for some rational explanation to present itself, but Emily caught his gaze before he could disappear into the crowd. Her face didn't change, not shock, not panic, just the calm acknowledgement of someone who had expected this moment to come eventually. She gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, then turned back to her phone as though nothing had happened. But it had. Daniel's world, carefully curated and controlled, had just tilted on its axis. Still rooted to the spot, he felt his pulse thundering in his ears. He forced himself to move, not toward her, but toward the gate just beyond where she stood. His eyes remained fixed ahead, but his thoughts spiraled into chaos. What the hell was she doing here? Who were those boys? No, he knew who they were. The question wasn't their identity. The question was why he was only discovering them now. A faint voice crackled over the intercom, announcing a gate change for his flight. Daniel barely registered it. His feet moved on autopilot, but instead of walking past her, he slowed, then stopped. The boys noticed him first. The one with the headphones glanced up, his brows furrowing slightly. The one with the restless stance froze, his blue eyes, the exact same shade as Daniel's, narrowing in curiosity. The third, the one with the phone, nudged Emily lightly. Her gaze shifted from the screen to Daniel, and for the first time, he saw something flicker in her eyes, a mix of resignation and defiance. She said nothing, simply tilting her chin up, as if daring him to speak. "Emily," Daniel said, his voice lower than he intended. He cleared his throat, willing away the tightness. "Long time, Daniel," she replied evenly. Her voice hadn't changed, still carrying that cool confidence that had once both irritated and fascinated him. "I thought you'd be on some private jet by now." The comment stung, though it wasn't meant to. Sometimes commercial is more convenient. Convenience, right? Her lips twitched into a brief, humorless smile. Some things never change. Daniel's eyes flicked to the boys, who were watching the exchange with quiet curiosity. He looked back at Emily, his chest tightening with a question he wasn't sure how to ask. "Are these—" His voice trailed off and he swallowed hard, trying again. "Are they yours?" Emily's eyes locked with his, unflinching. "Yes," she said simply. Then, after a pause that felt like an eternity, she added, "And yours." The words landed like a blow. Daniel staggered, metaphorically if not physically. He opened his mouth to respond, but found no words. The boys exchanged glances, clearly sensing the tension but saying nothing. Emily straightened, slinging her purse over her shoulder. "We've got a connection to catch," she said, breaking the silence. Her voice was firm but not unkind. Take care of yourself, Daniel. Before he could respond, she turned and began walking toward another gate, the boys following in her wake. They moved like a tide, swift and unrelenting, leaving Daniel standing alone in the middle of the terminal. His fingers tightened around the strap of his bag as he stared after them. His mind churned with questions, accusations, regrets, and one undeniable truth: life as he knew it had just changed forever. Daniel stood motionless in the center of the terminal, a tide of travelers flowing around him. His body felt numb, his mind locked in a relentless loop of disbelief and anger. How could Emily have kept something like this from him? 3 boys, his sons had grown into teenagers, and he hadn't even known they existed. The announcement of another boarding call jarred him back into the present. His flight was leaving soon, but for the first time in years, Daniel didn't care about missing a meeting. Instead, his eyes tracked Emily and the boys as they disappeared into the crowd. He couldn't just let this moment slip through his fingers. His feet moved before his brain could catch up, weaving through the chaos of the terminal, scanning faces, his pulse quickening with every second they remained out of sight. Finally, he spotted them near a coffee kiosk. Emily stood with her arms crossed, her back to him, while the boys leaned against a row of chairs immersed in their own world. Daniel hesitated, unsure of what he would even say, but the tidal wave of emotions surging through him, anger, confusion, betrayal, propelled him forward. "Emily," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. She turned slowly, her expression calm, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of weariness. "Daniel," she replied evenly, as though she'd been expecting this. "We need to talk," he said, glancing at the boys. Privately, Emily hesitated, glancing at her sons. "Wait here," she told them, her tone firm but not unkind. The boys didn't argue, though one of them, Daniel couldn't tell which, cast him a curious glance as she stepped away with him. They walked a short distance, far enough to avoid being overheard, but close enough to keep the boys in view. Emily turned to face him, arms still crossed, her expression guarded. "Start talking," she said. Daniel took a deep breath, trying to steady his voice. "How long have you been planning to tell me? Or were you planning to tell me at all?" Her jaw tightened, but she didn't look away. "It wasn't a decision I made lightly, Daniel. Believe me, I had my reasons." "Reasons?" he repeated, his voice rising. "You kept 3 children from me, Emily, my children. Do you have any idea how insane that sounds?" She bristled but held her ground. "Do you have any idea what it was like back then? You walked away, Daniel. You made it perfectly clear what your priorities were. You wanted success, freedom, no strings attached. What was I supposed to do? Chase you down, tell you I was pregnant, and hope you'd suddenly become the kind of man who wanted a family?" Her words hit him like a slap. He opened his mouth to argue but faltered. She wasn't entirely wrong. Back then, he'd been a different person. Restless, ambitious, unwilling to be tied down by anything or anyone. But still, "That wasn't your call to make," he said, his voice quieter now, though no less firm. "I had a right to know." Emily's eyes softened, but only slightly. "Maybe you're right," she admitted, "but at the time, I thought I was doing the best thing for them. And for myself, I didn't want to beg someone to stay when they didn't want to." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. "And now, what changed? Why are you here? Why now?" "I didn't plan this, if that's what you're thinking," she said. "We're just passing through. My sister lives in the city. The boys wanted to visit her for the holidays." Her explanation made sense, but it didn't make him feel any better. "So you weren't going to tell me at all," he said bitterly. "You were just going to let me walk past you like a stranger." Emily sighed, rubbing her temples. "I don't know, Daniel. Maybe I thought about it, but what difference would it make? What do you want me to say, that I made a mistake? Fine, I made a mistake, but they're my boys. I raised them. I've been there for every scraped knee, every parent-teacher conference, every sleepless night. You haven't." Her words stung, but they also rang true. He had no idea what it meant to be a father. The very concept was foreign to him. But standing here now, he couldn't ignore the pull he felt toward those boys, or the weight of the years he'd missed. "I don't want to fight with you," he said finally, his voice softening. I don't know what to do with this." Emily studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "I don't know either," she admitted, "but I do know one thing. They're not ready for this. Not today." Daniel nodded slowly, though the thought of walking away felt unbearable. "Then when?" She shook her head. "I don't have an answer for you, not yet. But if you're serious about wanting to be part of their lives, you're going to have to prove it." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. She glanced back toward the boys, who were still waiting by the chairs, oblivious to the storm raging just a few feet away. "I need to get them to our gate," she said, her tone signaling the end of the conversation. "You have my number. If you really want to talk, you know where to find me." With that, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the polished floor. The boys followed her without question, leaving Daniel alone once again. As he watched them disappear into the crowd, a strange, unfamiliar feeling settled in his chest. For the first time in years, Daniel Cross felt like a man who didn't have all the answers. Daniel stood in the middle of the bustling terminal, the cacophony of announcements and hurried footsteps around him fading into white noise. Emily's words echoed in his mind. "If you're serious about wanting to be part of their lives, you're going to have to prove it. Prove it. To her, to them, to himself." But how could he prove anything if he didn't even know where to start? He had never been one to second-guess himself, but now, every decision he'd ever made seemed to demand re-examination. Shaking himself out of his stupor, Daniel glanced at the departure board. His flight to New York was flashing last call, but it didn't matter. He wasn't getting on that plane. Instead, he turned and headed for a nearby seating area, where he dropped his bag and pulled out his phone. His assistant would be furious about the missed meetings, but that was a problem for another day. Right now, he had a much bigger issue to confront. He opened a blank text to Emily, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "What do I even say?" He typed and erased the same message 3 times before settling on something simple. "We need to talk. Soon. I'm not walking away from this." He hit send and exhaled, staring at the screen as if willing her to respond immediately. Minutes ticked by with no reply. Frustrated, Daniel pocketed his phone and leaned back in his chair, trying to process everything that had just happened. The image of the boys burned in his mind. 3 teenagers, each a reflection of himself at that age, standing there, oblivious to the storm they'd unwittingly unleashed. Who were they? What were their names? Did they know anything about him? Did they even care? The questions swirled, each one heavier than the last. He couldn't sit still anymore. Rising to his feet, Daniel grabbed his bag and walked aimlessly through the terminal, his thoughts a chaotic jumble. His feet led him toward the gate Emily had mentioned during their brief conversation. As he neared it, he spotted them again, Emily and the boys seated together near the boarding area. Emily was flipping through a magazine, but her posture was stiff, her body angled slightly toward the boys as if she were shielding them. The 3 of them sat in a row, each absorbed in their own little world. The one with the headphones had taken them off and was scrolling through his phone. The hoodie-clad boy had his head tilted back, eyes closed as though he were trying to block out the noise. The last one, the one who seemed the most like Daniel, was staring out the window, his expression distant. Daniel hesitated. This wasn't the time or place for a scene, and yet the idea of walking away felt unbearable. He needed to know more, to understand what had happened during the years he'd missed. But how could he approach them without making things worse? Just then, his phone buzzed. He glanced down and saw Emily's name. The message was short, almost curt. "Not here. Call me tonight, after they're asleep." Daniel clenched his jaw, the impatience gnawing at him. But he knew she was right. The boys didn't need to be blindsided by this, any more than they already had been. He slipped his phone back into his pocket and retreated to a nearby coffee shop, where he ordered a black coffee and sank into a corner booth. He needed to think. Hours later, back in his penthouse apartment, Daniel paced the floor, phone in hand. The sprawling city skyline, usually a source of pride and inspiration, now felt cold and distant. His entire life had been built on control, of his business, his image, his future. But now, faced with something he couldn't manipulate or strategize his way through, he felt untethered. At precisely 9:30 p.m., his phone buzzed. Emily was calling. "Hello?" he answered quickly, his voice tense. "It's me," she said. Her tone was quiet, but steady. "The boys are asleep. What do you want to know?" Daniel sat down heavily on the edge of his couch, running a hand through his hair. "Everything," he said. "I want to know everything." Emily sighed, and for a moment, he thought she might hang up, but then she began to speak. "After you left, I found out I was pregnant about 2 months later," she said. "I thought about telling you, but every time I picked up the phone, I'd hear your voice in my head, telling me about your plans, your vision, how nothing could get in the way. So I didn't call. I told myself I could handle it on my own." "And you did," Daniel said, his voice filled with quiet bitterness. "You handled it so well I never even knew they existed." "You think it was easy for me?" Emily shot back. I was 24, Daniel. I didn't have a plan or a career or a clue about what I was doing, but I figured it out because I had no other choice. Her voice softened slightly. And for what it's worth, I wasn't trying to punish you. I thought I was sparing them from the kind of disappointment I felt when you left. Daniel was silent, her words cutting deeper than he cared to admit. What are their names? He asked finally, his voice hoarse. Ethan, Liam, and Caleb, she said. Ethan's the oldest by about 5 minutes. Caleb's the quiet one. Liam's, well, he's Liam. You'll see. Daniel swallowed hard, the names settling over him like a strange kind of weight. Do they know about me? Emily hesitated. Not exactly, she admitted. They know pieces. I told them their father was someone I cared about a long time ago, but I didn't tell them your name. I didn't think it mattered. Didn't matter? Daniel's voice rose. I'm their father, Emily. Of course it matters. They've gotten along just fine without you, she said sharply, then sighed. Look, I'm not trying to shut you out, but you can't just drop into their lives and expect everything to fall into place. It doesn't work that way. So what now? Daniel asked, his voice quieter. There was a long pause before Emily spoke again. I don't know, she said, but if you're serious about this, you're going to have to take it slow, and you're going to have to earn it. The line went silent for a moment, and Daniel realized she was waiting for him to agree. I will, he said finally, whatever it takes. Good, Emily said, then we'll figure it out. But not tonight. I need to get some sleep. With that, she hung up, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts, and a long, uncertain road ahead. Daniel didn't sleep much that night. The city skyline, usually a comforting sight from his penthouse, offered no solace. He kept replaying Emily's words over and over in his head. Ethan, Liam, and Caleb. Their names were seared into his memory now, their faces haunting every corner of his mind. He had missed everything. First steps, first words, scraped knees, birthdays. He wasn't even a ghost in their lives, he was a stranger. By morning, he knew he couldn't wait for Emily to take the next step. If he wanted to be part of their lives, he had to start now. But how? Showing up unannounced wasn't an option. Emily had made it clear he had to tread carefully, and he wasn't about to risk alienating her or the boys before he even had a chance to know them. He picked up his phone and stared at Emily's number. For a man used to making billion-dollar decisions in seconds, the idea of sending a simple text felt impossibly daunting. Finally, he typed, I'd like to see them. On your terms. Tell me when and where. The reply came an hour later as he paced his apartment. Tomorrow. 3 p.m. The park near 8th and Vine. Don't overwhelm them. The next day, Daniel arrived at the park 15 minutes early, his nerves fraying with each passing second. It was a bright, crisp afternoon, the kind of day that invited families to flood the playgrounds and trails. He scanned the area, searching for Emily. His heart lurched when he spotted her near a bench, her auburn hair catching the sunlight. She wasn't alone. Ethan, Liam, and Caleb were with her, each engaged in their own activity. Ethan was tossing a frisbee with Caleb, while Liam sat on the edge of the fountain, staring at the water as if lost in thought. Daniel hesitated. He felt an almost primal urge to walk over and claim his place, to tell the boys he was their father and had every right to be there. But he knew better. Emily had warned him not to overwhelm them, and the last thing he wanted was to alienate them before he even had a chance to explain himself. Emily noticed him first. She gave a slight nod, her expression guarded but not hostile. She gestured subtly for him to come over. Daniel straightened his shoulders and walked toward her, his heart pounding harder with each step. Hi, he said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Hi, Emily replied. Her eyes flicked toward the boys. They don't know yet. I told them you were an old friend. Daniel winced at the term but nodded. Got it. Ethan noticed him first. He paused mid-throw, eyeing Daniel curiously. Who's that? He asked, loud enough for all 3 boys to hear. Emily turned toward them, her tone carefully neutral. This is Daniel. He's someone I used to know a long time ago. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Like, a boyfriend? Liam smirked. Mom had a boyfriend? Caleb said nothing, but his eyes flicked between Daniel and his brothers, quietly observing. Daniel felt a lump in his throat as he faced them. Hi, he said awkwardly, shoving his hands into his pockets. It's nice to meet you. Ethan tilted his head, scrutinizing Daniel with a level of intensity that felt far too adult for a 16-year-old. So, what are you doing here? Daniel hesitated, glancing at Emily for help. She didn't offer any. He cleared his throat and tried again. I ran into your mum at the airport the other day and, well, I thought I'd stop by and say hello. Stop by, Liam echoed, raising an eyebrow. To a park? Emily stepped in before the conversation could veer further off course. I thought it might be nice for you to meet someone I knew when I was younger. That's all. Ethan didn't look convinced, but he shrugged and turned back to Caleb. You still want to throw the frisbee or what? Caleb nodded, and the two resumed their game. Liam lingered by the fountain, watching Daniel with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Daniel felt a wave of relief that the boys hadn't pushed harder, but he also couldn't ignore the distance in their reactions. He wasn't sure what he'd expected, certainly not a warm embrace, but the coldness of it still stung. Emily leaned closer, her voice low. They're not going to open up to you overnight. Just let them get used to you. Daniel nodded, swallowing the knot in his throat. What about you? He asked, keeping his voice equally soft. She gave him a look that was hard to read. I'm not the one you need to win over. Over the next hour, Daniel did his best to engage with the boys without pushing too hard. He complimented Ethan's aim with the frisbee, but the teenager barely acknowledged him. Caleb, quieter than his brothers, seemed polite but distant, responding with one-word answers when Daniel asked about his favorite sports and hobbies. Liam was the most difficult to read. He stayed by the fountain for most of the afternoon, occasionally glancing in Daniel's direction, but saying very little. At one point, Daniel approached him, unsure of what to say. So, Daniel began awkwardly, your mom says you're into art. Liam glanced up, surprised. Yeah, he said after a pause. How'd you know? She told me, Daniel said with a small smile. What do you like to draw? Liam hesitated, then shrugged. Stuff. Stuff, huh? Like cartoons? Portraits? Mostly landscapes, Liam admitted. He looked at Daniel more closely now, as if trying to figure him out. Why do you care? The question caught Daniel off guard, but he answered honestly, because I want to get to know you, all of you. Liam studied him for a moment longer, then nodded once before turning back to the fountain. It wasn't much, but it felt like a small step forward. By the time the afternoon ended, Daniel felt emotionally drained, but cautiously hopeful. The boys hadn't warmed to him, not yet, but they hadn't rejected him outright either. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As Emily called the boys over and prepared to leave, Daniel lingered for a moment, watching them walk away. For the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider looking in. He felt like a man on the brink of something new, something uncertain, but something worth fighting for. Emily leaned back in her chair, letting the chatter of the boys in the car wash over her. The engine hummed steadily beneath her as they drove back home, but her mind was far from the road. She stole a glance in the rearview mirror. Ethan was engrossed in his phone. Caleb stared out the window, and Liam, her middle son, had his headphones on, staring absently at the passing buildings. Her fingers tightened on the steering wheel. The afternoon at the park had gone better than she'd expected, or maybe she'd simply feared the worst. Daniel had kept his word. He didn't push too hard, didn't overwhelm the boys. Still, it had been surreal watching him with them, trying to bridge an invisible chasm that had taken 16 years to form. 16 years. It felt like a lifetime ago, yet also like yesterday. She could still see Daniel as he had been back then, confident, driven, full of big ideas and boundless ambition. He'd been magnetic in a way that left her both in awe and on edge. She loved him, truly, deeply, but even back then she'd known that his dreams had no room for her, or anyone else. The discovery of her pregnancy had been a whirlwind of emotions. Fear, excitement, anger, and finally resolve. She had made the decision on her own, convincing herself that it was better this way. Better to raise the boys alone than to tether them to a father who didn't want to be tied down. But seeing Daniel again had stirred up all the feelings she'd buried. She didn't regret her choice. How could she when it had given her Ethan, Liam, and Caleb? But she couldn't ignore the pang of guilt that twisted in her stomach every time she thought about Daniel's face at the airport. The shock, the betrayal. It had been written all over him. Mom? Caleb's voice broke through her thoughts. She blinked, glancing at him in the mirror. Yeah, sweetheart. Who is that guy? Caleb asked. His tone was careful, not suspicious, but curious. Daniel, he seems weird. Ethan snorted, not looking up from his phone. He's not weird, he's just trying too hard. He kept asking about my frisbee throw like it's a big deal or something. Liam, ever the quiet observer, pulled one side of his headphones off. He's hiding something, he said. His tone wasn't accusing, just matter of fact. The way he looks at us, it's weird, like he knows us or something. Emily inhaled sharply. but kept her expression calm. "Daniel's someone I used to know a long time ago," she said carefully. "He wanted to meet you guys, that's all." "Why now?" Liam pressed, his gaze meeting hers in the mirror. "If he's been around this whole time, why'd he just show up?" Emily tightened her grip on the wheel. She'd known the questions would come, but she hadn't expected them so soon. "It's complicated," she said after a pause. "But sometimes people come back into your life when you least expect it. That doesn't mean it's a bad thing." Liam didn't look convinced, but he didn't push further. Instead, he replaced his headphones and leaned his head against the window. Caleb, ever the peacemaker, let the conversation drop, though Emily could see the curiosity still flickering in his eyes. Ethan, however, wasn't done. "You know what's weird, though," he said, finally looking up from his phone. "He kind of looks like us." Emily's stomach flipped, but she kept her face neutral. "Lots of people look similar," she said lightly. "It doesn't mean anything." Ethan shrugged, unconvinced but not particularly interested in pursuing the topic. "Whatever," he muttered, going back to his phone. The rest of the ride was silent, but Emily's mind raced. The boys weren't stupid. They were sharp, perceptive, and had an uncanny knack for picking up on things she wished they wouldn't. It was only a matter of time before they started connecting the dots, and she wasn't sure how she would handle it when they did. That night, after the boys had gone to bed, Emily sat at the kitchen table with a glass of wine, staring at her phone. Daniel's name was still at the top of her text history. She had spent so many years convincing herself that keeping him out of their lives was the right decision, and now, with him suddenly back, she wasn't sure what to believe anymore. Had she made a mistake? Would the boys have been better off with Daniel in their lives from the beginning? Or had she spared them the pain of being let down by a man who might not have been ready to be a father? The truth was, she didn't know. All she knew was that the walls she'd built to protect her family were beginning to crack, and Daniel was pushing at the edges of the life she had so carefully constructed. Her phone buzzed, startling her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Daniel. How did they take it? Emily stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. She wanted to tell him the truth, that the boys were curious, that they'd noticed the resemblance, that the questions were already beginning. But she also wanted to protect him, to give him the time to figure out his own feelings before diving headfirst into the chaos of parenthood. Finally, she typed back, "They're curious, but it's going to take time." The reply came almost instantly. "I'm not going anywhere." Emily stared at the words, her chest tightening. She wasn't sure if they were meant to reassure her or to remind her of just how much had changed. Either way, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far more complicated than she'd ever imagined. The next morning, the house was unusually quiet. Emily stood at the kitchen counter, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee as she glanced at the clock. The boys were typically buzzing with energy by now, arguing over cereal or fighting for the bathroom. But today, the silence felt heavy. She didn't have to wait long to find out why. Ethan was the first to emerge from his room, his face unusually serious. He plopped into a chair at the dining table and stared at her, his phone in his hand. Caleb followed shortly after, his hair still mussed from sleep, but his expression was pensive. Liam came last, earbuds dangling from his ears, his hoodie pulled up over his head. He didn't sit, instead leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. Emily set her mug down, her stomach twisting. "What's with the looks?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he spun his phone around on the table, the screen glowing. "I Googled him." Emily's heart sank. "Googled who?" "You know who," Ethan said, his tone sharp. "Daniel Cross. That guy you brought to the park yesterday." Emily closed her eyes for a brief second, willing herself to stay calm. "And what did you find?" "Everything," Ethan said, his voice rising. "He's a millionaire, owns some huge company. His name's in, like, 100 articles, and yet somehow you never mentioned him before. Why?" Emily opened her mouth, but no words came. Caleb, usually the quiet one, spoke up next. "Is he our dad?" The question hung in the air like a thunderclap. Emily froze, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. She'd known this moment would come, but she still wasn't ready for it. "Guys," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "This is complicated." "That's not an answer," Ethan said, his tone accusing. "It's either yes or no." Liam, who had been silent until now, dropped his arms and fixed her with a piercing look. "It's yes, isn't it?" Emily let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she placed them flat on the counter. "Yes," she admitted finally. "Daniel is your father." The room erupted. "What the hell, Mum?" Ethan shouted, pushing his chair back with a screech. "You've been lying to us this whole time." I wasn't lying, Emily said quickly, though the words felt hollow even to her. You just didn't tell us. Liam interrupted, his voice cold. Same thing. Caleb's expression was a mix of shock and hurt. So he didn't even know about us? He asked quietly. Emily's heart broke at the pain in his voice. No, she said softly. He didn't know. I made that choice because I thought it was the best thing for all of us. How is this the best thing? Ethan shot back. You robbed us of a dad. You didn't even give him a chance. Emily's defenses flared. I did what I thought was right at the time. You have no idea how hard it was. Yeah, well, it wasn't hard for us, right? Ethan snapped, his sarcasm biting. Because we didn't even get a say. Liam's face was unreadable, but his voice was quiet and deliberate. Did you think we wouldn't notice, that we wouldn't care? Emily blinked back tears, her composure threatening to crack. I wasn't trying to hurt you, she said. I wanted to protect you. From what? Ethan demanded. From having a father. From knowing the truth. The questions hit her like blows, each one more devastating than the last. She glanced at Caleb, who had gone silent, his head bowed as if trying to process it all. Liam stared out the window, his jaw tight. Ethan stood with his arms crossed, his anger radiating in waves. I don't expect you to understand, Emily said finally, her voice trembling. But I made the best decision I could with the information I had. And whether you believe it or not, I've only ever wanted what's best for you. That's a nice excuse, Ethan muttered, grabbing his phone and storming out of the room. The sound of his bedroom door slamming echoed through the house. Caleb hesitated, his eyes flicking to hers. You should have told us, he said quietly, his voice filled with disappointment. Then he followed Ethan, leaving only Liam behind. For a moment, the two of them stood in silence, the tension in the air almost unbearable. Finally, Liam spoke, his voice low but sharp. I don't know what you're afraid of, Mom, but if he's really our dad, we deserve to know him. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Emily alone in the kitchen. Her legs felt like jelly, and she collapsed into the nearest chair, her head in her hands. The cracks she'd been trying so desperately to hold together had finally shattered. The boys knew the truth now, and she had no idea how to pick up the pieces. Later that evening, after the boys had retreated to their rooms and the house had fallen into uneasy silence, Emily called Daniel. He picked up after the first ring. They know, she said, without preamble. There was a pause. What did you tell them? The truth, she said bitterly. At least as much of it as I could get out before they tore me apart. Daniel's sigh was audible through the line. How bad was it? They're angry, Emily admitted. At me, at you, at everything. Daniel didn't respond immediately, but when he spoke, his voice was calm. What do you need from me? Emily hesitated, the weight of her choices pressing down on her. I don't know, she said honestly, but they're not going to just let this go. They'll want to see you again. I'll be ready, Daniel said firmly. Whatever they need, whatever it takes. Emily closed her eyes, feeling the tears threaten again. I hope you mean that, she whispered. I do, Daniel replied. For the first time she believed him, but belief wasn't enough to mend what was broken. Only time would tell if they could piece their fractured family back together. Daniel sat in his car outside the park, gripping the steering wheel as though it could anchor him. He'd arrived early again, partly to prepare himself, partly because the weight of the situation wouldn't let him sit idly at home. Today wasn't going to be like their first meeting. This time, the boys knew who he was. He had spent hours the previous night replaying Emily's words. They're angry. At me, at you, at everything. He wasn't naive enough to think this would be easy, but knowing that didn't make it any less intimidating. For years, he'd been in control of his world, commanding boardrooms, making decisions that shaped industries. But this, earning the trust of 3 teenage boys who had every reason to resent him, was a challenge unlike any he'd ever faced. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Emily. We're here, near the basketball court. Daniel exhaled sharply, his stomach twisting with a mix of anticipation and dread. He stepped out of the car, smoothing his jacket as he walked toward the court. The park was livelier today, filled with the sound of children laughing, dogs barking, and the rhythmic thud of basketballs hitting pavement. But as he approached the familiar figures, the noise seemed to fade. Emily stood to the side, her arms crossed, watching her sons with an expression that was equal parts wary and protective. Ethan was shooting hoops with Caleb, while Liam sat on a nearby bench, sketchbook in hand. They didn't notice him at first, but when Emily caught his eye and gave a slight nod, Ethan turned around. For a moment they just stared at each other. Daniel resisted the urge to say something, letting Ethan make the first move. The boy rolled the basketball under his foot, his expression guarded. "You're late," Ethan said flatly, though Daniel could see the faintest hint of a smirk at the corner of his mouth. Daniel checked his watch. "I'm actually 5 minutes early." Ethan shrugged, clearly unimpressed. "You're lucky, I hate waiting." Emily gave Daniel a look as if to say, "Good luck," before stepping back to let him handle it. Daniel gestured toward the basketball hoop. "You any good?" Ethan's eyebrows shot up. "Better than you." Daniel grinned, sensing the challenge. "I guess we'll see about that." Ethan tossed him the ball. "First to 5? Daniel caught it, dribbling a few times to test his grip. "You're on." The game was fast and aggressive. Ethan played with the kind of raw energy Daniel recognized from his own youth, a mix of determination and a need to prove himself. He wasn't afraid to shove a little or take risks, and Daniel found himself both impressed and exhausted trying to keep up. Caleb, who had been sitting out at first, eventually joined in. He wasn't as bold as Ethan, but had a natural grace in his movements, a quiet focus that reminded Daniel of Emily. The two brothers worked together seamlessly, passing the ball back and forth with practiced ease. Despite being outnumbered, Daniel managed to hold his own, though he suspected Ethan was taking it easy on him. When Ethan sank the final shot, he grinned triumphantly. 5-4, Ethan said, holding up the ball. "Told you I was better." Daniel laughed, wiping sweat from his brow. "I guess I'll have to practice." Ethan tossed the ball to Caleb, who started dribbling absent-mindedly. "Not bad for an old guy," Ethan admitted grudgingly. It was a small victory, but Daniel took it. "Thanks, I think." While Ethan and Caleb went back to their game, Daniel turned his attention to Liam, who was still sitting on the bench, his head bent over his sketchbook. He walked over slowly, careful not to intrude. "Mind if I sit?" Daniel asked. Liam didn't look up. "It's a free park." Daniel sat down, glancing at the sketchbook. Liam was working on a detailed drawing of the park, a scene filled with trees, benches, and scattered figures. His pencil moved with confidence, shading and refining the shapes with precision. "That's really good," Daniel said sincerely. Liam shrugged. "It's just a sketch." "It's more than that," Daniel said. "You've got talent." Liam finally looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What do you know about art?" "Not much," Daniel admitted, "but I know when something's done with care." "And that?" He pointed at the sketch. "It's impressive." Liam stared at him for a moment, as if trying to decide whether to accept the compliment. Finally, he muttered, "Thanks." Daniel leaned back on the bench, watching as Liam went back to his drawing. "Your mom told me you like landscapes." "They're easier," Liam said without looking up. "People are hard, too much movement." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "I get that, but I think you're good enough to do both." Liam's pencil paused mid-stroke. He glanced at Daniel again, this time with a flicker of curiosity. "Why are you even here?" The question wasn't angry, but it wasn't entirely neutral either. Daniel took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Because I want to know you," he said honestly. "All of you. I know I've missed a lot, but I'm here now, and I want to be part of your lives if you'll let me." Liam didn't respond right away. He closed his sketchbook and stood up, tucking it under his arm. "We'll see," he said, before walking off to join his brothers. As the afternoon wore on, the boys gradually began to relax around him. Ethan was still guarded but willing to banter. Caleb, though quieter, offered the occasional shy smile. And Liam, while still distant, no longer seemed actively resistant to Daniel's presence. Emily watched it all unfold from a distance, her expression unreadable. When the boys finally gathered their things and started heading for the car, Daniel walked over to her. "How'd I do?" he asked, half joking. "You didn't screw it up," she said, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. "That's something." Daniel chuckled, though his heart felt heavy. He knew he had a long way to go, but today had given him something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. As he watched the boys pile into the car, laughing and shoving each other like siblings do, he made a silent promise to himself. He wouldn't let them down again, not this time. The following weeks became a slow, careful dance. Daniel didn't push too hard. He knew better now, but he didn't back off either. Every meeting with the boys was a small battle for connection, each one requiring a balance of patience, persistence, and humility. It wasn't easy. Nothing about this was. Daniel found himself re-evaluating his priorities. Work, once the center of his universe, felt distant, almost irrelevant. He still took meetings, still signed off on deals, but his focus was elsewhere. His assistant, Paula, had noticed the shift, though she was smart enough not to comment. Instead, She adjusted his schedule to accommodate his newfound habit of leaving early and skipping late-night calls. Today was no different. At precisely 3 o'clock, Daniel parked outside the local high school, waiting for the boys to finish their after-school activities. This was his new routine, showing up. It seemed small, but he'd learned that consistency mattered more than grand gestures. The school's doors opened, and a stream of teenagers spilled out onto the sidewalk. Daniel spotted Ethan first, his broad shoulders and confident stride making him easy to pick out. Caleb followed close behind, his head down as he adjusted his backpack. Liam was the last to emerge, his sketchbook tucked under one arm, earbuds in as usual. Daniel stepped out of the car and waved. Ethan saw him and rolled his eyes but made his way over, Caleb and Liam trailing behind. "You didn't have to come," Ethan said as he reached the car. His tone was casual, but there was no edge to it, no challenge. That was progress. "I know," Daniel said, "but I wanted to." Ethan shrugged and climbed into the passenger seat without another word. Caleb gave Daniel a shy smile as he slid into the back, and Liam nodded slightly before following his brother. The ride to the park was quiet at first, the boys lost in their own worlds. Daniel didn't push for conversation. He'd learned to let them come to him on their terms. "So," Ethan said, suddenly breaking the silence, "Mom says you played basketball in high school." Daniel glanced at him, surprised. "I did. Point guard." "Why?" Ethan smirked. "You don't play like it." Daniel laughed, the tension in the car easing slightly. "Give me a break, it's been a while." "Clearly," Ethan said, though there was a hint of a grin on his face. Caleb leaned forward, resting his chin on the back of Daniel's seat. "What else did you do? Besides basketball, I mean." Daniel thought for a moment. "I worked part-time at a hardware store, mostly stocking shelves. Spent a lot of time tinkering with computers, though. That's how I got into tech." "Were you a nerd?" Caleb asked, his eyes bright with curiosity. "Definitely," Daniel admitted with a chuckle. "Still am, probably." Ethan snorted, but Caleb looked impressed. Liam, however, remained silent, staring out the window. Daniel glanced at him in the rearview mirror, wondering what was going on behind those quiet eyes. At the park, Ethan and Caleb quickly commandeered a basketball court, challenging each other to a game of one-on-one. Daniel stayed on the sidelines, content to watch. Liam, as usual, drifted off to a quieter spot, settling under a tree with his sketchbook. After a while, Daniel walked over to him, careful not to disturb his drawing. "Mind if I sit?" Liam shrugged without looking up. "Go ahead." Daniel lowered himself onto the grass, watching as Liam's pencil moved deftly across the page. The drawing was of the basketball court, the players reduced to fluid, shadowy shapes. It was abstract, yet alive, full of energy. "That's incredible," Daniel said sincerely. Liam paused, glancing at him. "Thanks." They sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the park filling the gaps between them. Finally, Liam spoke. "Why are you really here?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. "Is it guilt, or do you just feel bad for us?" Daniel took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "It's not guilt," he said. "It's regret. I regret not being there for you, for all of you. But more than that, I want to be here now, because you matter, because I care." Liam's pencil hovered over the page, his gaze fixed on the drawing. "You don't even know us." "I'm trying to," Daniel said. "I know I can't make up for the time we lost, but I want to be part of your lives if you'll let me." Liam didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. "You don't get to just show up and fix everything." "I know," Daniel said gently, "and I'm not trying to. I just want to be here, for the good stuff, the bad stuff, and everything in between." Liam looked at him then, really looked at him, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. After a long moment, he nodded slightly and went back to his sketching. By the time they left the park, the boys were visibly more relaxed. Ethan and Caleb had spent the ride home teasing each other about who had won their game, while Liam sat quietly in the back, his sketchbook open on his lap. Daniel didn't push for more. He knew better than to rush something fragile. When they pulled up in front of Emily's house, the boys climbed out, each offering a brief thanks before heading inside. Liam hesitated for a moment, then turned back to Daniel. "See you next time," he said softly. Daniel smiled, his chest tightening. "See you next time." As Liam disappeared into the house, Daniel leaned back in his seat, feeling something he hadn't felt in years: pride. He wasn't just a man chasing redemption anymore. He was a father, and for the first time he believed he could be the kind of father they deserved. Daniel leaned against the counter in Emily's kitchen, sipping from a mug of coffee while she cleaned up after dinner. The boys were in the living room, their laughter drifting into the room as they debated over a video game. For the first time since re-entering their lives, Daniel felt something resembling ease. "They seem to be warming up to you," Emily said, her back to him as she wiped the counters. Daniel smiled faintly. "I think warming up is generous. They've stopped looking at me like I'm an alien, though, so I'll take it." Emily chuckled, but her expression turned serious as she faced him. "They've been asking more questions. About you, about us." Daniel set his mug down. "What kind of questions?" "Ethan's curious about why you left," she said quietly. "He doesn't say it outright, but I can tell it's bothering him." Daniel's throat tightened. He'd been expecting this, but that didn't make it any easier. "What do you tell him?" "I tell him the truth," Emily said simply, "that you didn't know about them, that I made the decision to keep it from you." Daniel nodded, though the weight of her words sat heavily on his chest. "Do they blame you?" "Sometimes," she admitted, "but they're teenagers. They'll blame anyone who's in front of them when they're angry." Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't want them to blame you. It's not just on you, Emily. I should have been better back then. I should have—" "Don't," she interrupted, her tone firm but not unkind. "We both made choices. This isn't about blame anymore. It's about moving forward." Her words settled over him, quiet but grounding. For all their history, all the hurt and misunderstandings, Emily had a way of cutting through his self-recrimination with a calm clarity he envied. It was part of why he'd fallen for her in the first place. Later that evening, Daniel joined the boys in the living room. Ethan, Liam, and Caleb were sprawled on the couch, engrossed in a competitive round of a racing game. Daniel hesitated in the doorway, then stepped inside. "Mind if I watch?" he asked. "Sure," Ethan said without looking up, "but don't get mad when I destroy Caleb." "Keep talking," Caleb shot back, his eyes locked on the screen. "You're just mad because I beat you last round." Daniel chuckled as he sat on the armrest of the couch. "You guys play often?" "Every day," Ethan said. "You play?" "Not in years," Daniel admitted, "but I was decent back in the day." Ethan grinned, handing him a controller. "Prove it." The game started, and Daniel quickly realized just how rusty he was. The boys were relentless, darting past him and sabotaging his every move with practiced ease. By the time the race ended, he was dead last, much to their amusement. "Man, you're bad at this," Ethan teased, laughing. "I think I need more practice," Daniel said with a grin. Liam, who had been quieter than his brothers throughout the game, glanced at Daniel. "It's not about winning. You just need to get the feel of it." Daniel nodded, appreciating the advice. "Maybe you can give me some pointers next time." Liam gave a small smile, the first Daniel had seen from him all night. Maybe. Over the next few weeks, Daniel's presence became a regular part of their lives. He picked the boys up from school when Emily had late shifts, joined them for dinners, and even attended one of Ethan's basketball games. He cheered from the stands, feeling a swell of pride when Ethan scored a crucial three-pointer. Caleb started opening up more, sharing his love for science and his aspirations to become an engineer. He asked Daniel questions about his work, and Daniel found himself relishing the opportunity to share his knowledge. Liam, though still guarded, began inviting Daniel to look at his sketches, asking for feedback on his work. They didn't always talk, but the quiet moments they spent together felt significant. Ethan remained the most challenging, his sarcasm often a shield for deeper emotions. But even he began to thaw, allowing Daniel glimpses of the boy beneath the bravado. One evening, as Daniel was about to leave after dinner, Ethan stopped him in the hallway. "Hey," Ethan said, his voice low. I wanted to ask you something." Daniel turned, sensing the seriousness in Ethan's tone. "What's on your mind?" Ethan hesitated, his hands jammed into his pockets. "Why did you leave Mom? I mean, before you knew about us." The question hit Daniel like a blow, but he didn't shy away from it. "Because I was selfish," he said honestly. "I was young and I thought my career was the most important thing in the world. Your mom wanted different things I wasn't ready to give her. So I left." Ethan studied him, his expression unreadable. "Do you regret it?" "Every day," Daniel said quietly. "But the thing I regret most is not being there for you and your brothers. I missed so much, and I can't get that time back. All I can do now is try to make it right." Ethan nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Okay." "Okay?" Daniel asked. Ethan looked up, his expression softer than Daniel had ever seen it. "Yeah, okay." When Daniel drove home that night, he felt lighter than he had in years. For the first time, He wasn't just an outsider trying to break into their lives. He was becoming part of the family, one cautious, tentative step at a time. And for him, that was everything. Daniel arrived early at the soccer field, parking his car at the edge of the lot. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the field, where players in mismatched jerseys warmed up, their voices blending with the whistles and cheers from nearby games. He stepped out of his car, adjusting his jacket, and scanned the sidelines for familiar faces. Emily waved to him from a set of folding chairs near midfield. Her auburn hair caught the sunlight, making her easy to spot. Beside her, Caleb and Liam sat with a cooler between them, sharing a bag of chips. Daniel's chest tightened at the sight. It was still surreal, this feeling of belonging to something bigger than himself. As he walked over, Caleb noticed him first. "Hey, Daniel!" he called, waving enthusiastically. "Hey, buddy!" Daniel replied, a grin spreading across his face. He ruffled Caleb's hair as he reached the group, earning a mock scowl from the boy. "You're just in time," Emily said, standing to greet him. "Ethan's game starts in 10 minutes. Daniel nodded, his eyes drifting to the field where Ethan was practicing with his teammates. Even from a distance, Ethan's confidence was palpable. He moved with ease, passing the ball and shouting commands like a natural leader. Daniel couldn't help but feel proud. "Think he'll score today?" Daniel asked as he sat down next to Emily. "Knowing Ethan, he'll make sure he does," she said with a chuckle. The game started fast, the opposing team pressing hard. Ethan played midfield, controlling the pace and distributing passes with precision. Every time he touched the ball, Daniel leaned forward slightly, holding his breath as if willing him to succeed. "Come on, Ethan!" Caleb shouted, cupping his hands around his mouth. Liam gave a quieter cheer, his sketchbook balanced on his lap as he doodled the game's highlights. Daniel found himself swept up in the energy of the crowd. He cheered when Ethan made a clean pass and groaned when his shot skimmed just wide of the goal. By halftime, he was hoarse, but he didn't care. For the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. As the second half began, Ethan's team was trailing by 1 goal. The tension on the field was palpable, every play charged with urgency. With 5 minutes left, Ethan intercepted a pass and sprinted toward the goal. The crowd roared as he weaved past defenders, his movements fluid and decisive. "Go, Ethan!" Daniel shouted, rising to his feet. Ethan lined up his shot, and for a split second, time seemed to freeze. Then, with a powerful kick, he sent the ball sailing past the goalkeeper and into the net. The crowd erupted, and Ethan's teammates swarmed him, shouting and cheering. Daniel felt his throat tighten as pride swelled in his chest. "That's my boy," he murmured, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Emily glanced at him, her eyes soft. She didn't say anything, but her small smile said enough. After the game, Ethan jogged over to them, his face flushed and gleaming with sweat. He grinned as Caleb and Liam congratulated him, and even Emily couldn't resist pulling him into a quick hug. "Nice goal," Daniel said, extending his hand for a high five. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then slapped Daniel's hand with a grin. "Not bad, huh?" "Not bad at all," Daniel said, his voice filled with genuine pride. "You played like a pro out there." Ethan shrugged, but the faint blush on his cheeks betrayed his pleasure. "It's just a game." "Maybe," Daniel said, "but it's a game you nailed." The group walked toward the parking lot together, the boys laughing and teasing each other about their plans for the weekend. Daniel stayed a step behind, watching them with a mix of awe and gratitude. This wasn't the life he'd imagined for himself all those years ago, but it was the one he wanted now, more than anything. As they reached the cars, Emily turned to him. "You want to join us for pizza? The boys have a tradition after games." Daniel hesitated, surprised by the invitation. "Are you sure?" Emily smiled. "They'll be disappointed if you don't." Daniel looked at the boys, who were already piling into Emily's car, shouting about which toppings to order. For the first time, there was no hesitation, no doubt. "I'd love to," he said. At the pizzeria, Daniel found himself seated in a booth surrounded by chaos. Caleb was debating the merits of pineapple on pizza. Liam was sketching a caricature of their waiter, and Ethan was recounting his goal in exaggerated detail. Daniel laughed until his sides hurt, the warmth of the moment wrapping around him like a blanket. As the evening wound down, Ethan leaned over the table, his voice quiet enough that only Daniel could hear. "Hey," he said, "thanks for coming today." Daniel met his gaze, his heart swelling. "I wouldn't have missed it for the world." Ethan nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough. That night, as Daniel drove home, he replayed the day in his mind. It hadn't been perfect. There were still challenges ahead, still scars to heal, but it was real. He was no longer a stranger trying to force his way into their lives. He was part of their world now, and for the first time, he felt like he belonged. A new beginning, not just for him, but for all of them. And as he pulled into his driveway, Daniel made a silent promise to himself. He would keep showing up every day, for as long as they needed him, because they weren't just his past anymore. They were his future.